Snow sifted down over Manhattan like falling ash, muffling the pulse of the city beneath a delicate hush. It was Christmas Eve, and from the penthouse of the Morgan Tower, the skyline glittered like a frozen galaxy. Inside, the lights glowed, gold against polished marble and glass, reflecting off oil paintings whose artists were long dead and priceless. But the room was silent to silent for a place that had once hosted kings of industry and whispered revolutions. Alexander Morgan sat in a leather chair behind a monolithic mahogany desk. The manila envelope in front of him was unassuming, thin, unimportant at first glance, and yet it cast a longer shadow than the towering skyscrapers below. His fingers hovered over it, then withdrew, then returned again before finally tearing the flap with the precision of a man accustomed to control. It took only one page to unmake him. 3 months, he whispered, the syllables catching in the still air like smoke. 3 months to live. His hands were steady, as they had always been, but something in his chest had gone soft like steel, suddenly remembering it was once ore. He leaned back, loosening the silk tie that had always felt more like a noose than an accessory. The aged scotch he poured into a crystal glass caught the light like amber fire. He brought it to his lips, but the taste was ash, worthless. A monitor buzzed on the desk. Another meeting reminder. Another billion-dollar decision. Another 20 people waiting for his nod. He silenced it without a word. No wife. No children. No one to tell. He had buried Elizabeth 5 years ago, the cancer taking her slowly, viciously. They'd been too busy to start a family, always planning, always building. Time had seemed endless until at WASN single quotes T. The intercom chimed. Mr. Morgan, James, his driver, always so precise. The car is ready. Alexander stared at the envelope, then at his reflection in the glass beyond. Manhattan shimmered back, indifferent. He grabbed his coat and walked out. They drove in silence for a long while, past cathedrals lit for midnight mass and storefronts strung with weary lights. Somewhere near Fifth, carolers sang off key beneath the stone wings of St. Patrick's, but Alexander wasn't listening. Not really. Take the next right, he said suddenly. James hesitated. Sir, that's not the next right, James. The limo turned off the main road into a part of the city that wealth pretended didn't exist. Brick buildings with crumbling facades, a drugstore with bars on the windows, a broken street lamp humming above a narrow alley. Alexander pressed his palm against the cold glass. There. James pulled to a slow stop. Sir, this neighborhood. But Alexander was already stepping out into the snow. A gust of wind tore down the alley like a warning. He walked anyway. There were shadows at first. Bundled forms huddled beneath makeshift blankets of newspaper and cardboard. The oldest rose to his feet, posture rigid, eyes bright with suspicion. A child, but not a boy. Not anymore. We're not doing anything, he said sharply. Alexander raised both hands. I'm not the police. Silence. What are your names? He asked. The boy hesitated. Ethan. He gestured toward the others, Tyler and Thomas. Twins, clearly. That's Lucas and Dylan. 5 of them, the oldest maybe 15. The youngest no more than 7. Brothers? Alexander asked. Not by blood, Ethan said. By survival. Alexander felt something crack inside him. A soundless shift. He looked over his shoulder toward the limo. It waited like a portal to another universe. It's going to snow hard tonight, he said. I have a place. Warm. Beds. Food. Just for the night. Suspicion flared in their eyes, sharp and instinctive. But something else passed among them too. Hope. Maybe. Hunger. Desperation. We leave if we want. Ethan asked. Alexander nodded. Any time. The boys conferred in whispers. Then, finally, Ethan nodded once. 20 minutes later, the Morgan penthouse, which had never known the sound of laughter since Elizabeth's death, was filled with the cautious footsteps of 5 boys dragging worn duffel bags and haunted eyes. Through halls of gold and glass, they clustered together in the living room, as if the space itself might consume them. I'll be in my study, Alexander said. Kitchen stocked. Bedrooms are down the hall. Bathroom has everything you need. He turned to go, but a small voice stopped him. Why are you doing this? It was Dylan, tiny, watching him with unsettling intensity. Alexander paused. Because I can. But as he walked away, a single image lingered in the corner of his eye, a small girl in a red coat, standing just outside the glow of the streetlight, peering from behind a trash bin. He blinked, she was gone, and far down the alley. A city bus rumbled past, its headlights washing over an old driver behind the wheel. Calvin, weathered, quiet, watching the penthouse from a distance. His eyes didn't move. He just nodded once like a man watching a prophecy unfold, and drove on. The mansion had never been louder, not in sound necessarily, but in presence. It had always been a monument to silence, empty rooms filled with artifacts, long hallways that echoed every footstep like a reminder, the home of a man who had everything, and no one, until now. Alexander stood just inside his study, listening to the subtle chaos unfolding down the hall. Footsteps quick, uncertain, overlapping, a whispered argument, a door creaking open, the unmistakable crash of something fragile. He didn't flinch. He let it happen. He poured another scotch, didn't drink it. Instead, he stared at the glass, as if it might answer a question he hadn't dared ask. In the reflection, something flickered in the hallway mirror behind him red, but when he turned, nothing was there. The scotch remained untouched. Down the corridor, Ethan was doing recon. He didn't trust this place. He didn't trust Alexander. He didn't even trust the softness in the blankets they'd been given, because softness always came with a catch. Still, he cataloged everything: exits, cameras, blind spots. Dylan trailed behind him, wide-eyed, asking about everything. "Is this gold?" Dylan asked, tapping the lion-head faucet. "No," Ethan muttered. "It's the kind of metal rich people like to pretend is gold." Lucas had found the piano. It was old, grand, carved from something darker than mahogany and heavier than grief. He ran his fingers across the keys. They sounded like breath barely there. He had never played. He had never been taught, but somehow his fingers fell into rhythm, something slow, almost sorrowful, a lullaby for a house that had forgotten how to sleep. Tyler and Thomas were exploring the entertainment system, which looked more like the cockpit of a spaceship than anything earthly. They hacked it within minutes. Years of street-salvaged electronics had made them masters of intuition. "Who has a 30-foot screen in their living room?" Thomas muttered. "Someone who thinks the world is only worth watching, not living in," Tyler replied. They found the security feed by accident. 17 angles of the mansion: interior, exterior, roofline. Most showed snow-covered gardens or quiet halls, but one camera had a figure in it. "Who's that?" Tyler leaned forward. The girl in red, standing still at the wrought iron gate, staring into the lens. No movement, no blinking. And then, just as Thomas leaned forward to zoom in, she turned and vanished from frame. Not walked, not ran, vanished. "What the hell?" Tyler started, but the feed glitched. Static, then blank. "Guys," Thomas yelled. By the time the others arrived, the footage was gone, replaced by the driveway's empty view. "She was there," Tyler said, more to himself than anyone else. Lucas nodded. "I've seen her too." Dylan didn't speak. He already knew who she was. He just didn't know how. In his study, Alexander stared out over the city, eyes tracing the outlines of buildings he could name by memory. Each one had meant something once. Now they were just shapes, gray outlines against darker skies. He thought of Elizabeth, her laughter, the way she had once curled up on that very couch with a book about names for unborn daughters. "Avery," she'd whispered, half asleep. "If it's a girl, I want to name her Avery." He hadn't thought about that name in years. Until now. The door to the study creaked. Alexander turned, expecting a boy, but it was Calvin, the driver, silent as ever. "I thought you went home," Alexander said. Calvin stepped in, glancing at the untouched drink. "Didn't feel right," he answered. "You've worked for me 15 years, Calvin." "That's the most I've ever heard you say." Calvin smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been listening for a long time, sir." Alexander frowned. "To what?" "To the silence. It gets loud, eventually, louder than noise." A long pause passed between them. "Those boys," Calvin continued, "they'll either save you or destroy you." "Maybe both," Alexander said quietly. Calvin turned to go. "One more thing." Alexander looked up. "There's something in this house," Calvin said. "Something that was waiting." "For what?" "For someone to come back." Alexander didn't ask what that meant. He couldn't. The words struck too deep, like they were meant for a version of him he'd buried long ago. Later that night, Alexander found the library lights still on. He stepped inside quietly, expecting to shoo off the twins or pry Dylan from an encyclopedia. But it wasn't any of them. It was Lucas, alone at the long oak table, sketching feverishly on hotel notepads and junk mail envelopes. Alexander stepped closer. You draw. Lucas didn't look up. She won't stay still. Who? Lucas held up the sketch. The girl in red, every angle, every detail. Her eyes hollow and watching, her posture still, but not calm. She was in the hallway tonight, Lucas whispered. She's always watching, like she's waiting. Alexander's blood ran cold. You saw her? Lucas finally looked up. Didn't you? Outside, the snow fell harder, blanketing the mansion like time itself was trying to bury something. Inside, 6 souls shared one house, one secret, and one growing sense that this was more than fate. It was a reckoning, and something had already begun. The storm broke the next morning, not just the snowstorm that buried the city in silence, but the first true crack in the illusion of safety. The penthouse, which had started to hum with the rhythm of life, awkward dinners, laughter in the hallways, whispered stories before bed suddenly felt hollow again. It began with a vase. A centuries-old Chinese porcelain piece, blue dragon. Imperial air shattered in a burst of sound that echoed through the marble like a scream. Tyler had been chasing Thomas, both of them howling with laughter, until the collision stopped them cold. Alexander entered the room seconds later. His footsteps were measured, his expression unreadable. He stared at the wreckage. The boys went. Still, it was my fault, Ethan said quickly, though he hadn't been near the room. The others looked at him, confused. No, Thomas murmured. I said it was my fault. Ethan repeated, louder this time. Alexander raised his hand. Enough. Silence fell. All eyes on the man who had given them food, warmth, beds. The man they didn't quite trust, but had begun to hope might be something more. It's just porcelain, Alexander said finally. The relief was so immediate that the boys nearly exhaled in unison. But then he added, but this isn't a playground. You want a roughhouse. Do it outside. He turned and walked away, but something was different now. A wall had gone back up. The air turned colder than the weather outside. Later, Lucas wandered the hallways alone, no book in hand. He wasn't sketching tonight. He was trying to catch her. The girl in red. She had been standing in the hall outside Alexander's room again just for a second, watching him, watching all of them. She never blinked, her eyes too deep to know, and followed Lucas even after she disappeared. He tried to draw her again, but this time, her face changed every time his pencil touched paper. His hands trembled. That night, he tore the page out and set it in the fireplace. It wouldn't burn. In the basement, Ethan was watching something else. Alexander's behavior. The man had begun disappearing for hours at a time. No explanation, no driver. No one knew where he went. When he returned, he looked exhausted, eyes bloodshot, shakier, like the disease was eating more than just his body. It was gnawing at something deeper. And then came the visitor. Her name was Eleanor Hayes. She walked into the penthouse without being announced, her heels echoing on the marble like a verdict. She was Alexander's executive assistant for 20 years, and she hated the boys from the second she saw them. You're making a mistake, she told Alexander in his study, voice low and sharp. I've made bigger ones, Alexander said. You're not thinking clearly. This diagnosis, this charity project, it's clouding your judgment. They're not a project. They're thieves, she snapped. Scavengers. One of them tried to bypass your biometric safe last night. Alexander turned, slowly. Which one? Eleanor smiled, not sweetly. The youngest. Dylan stood in the doorway a moment later, blinking up at Alexander, who sat behind his desk like a judge ready to issue sentence. Did you try to open the safe? Dylan shrugged. I wasn't going to take anything. That wasn't the question. I just wanted to see how it worked. Eleanor watched like a hawk. Alexander rubbed his eyes. Next time, ask. Adults don't usually say yes. The room went still. Even Eleanor seemed unsure how to react. Go, Alexander said to Dylan. The boy lingered a moment, then slipped away. You see, Eleanor hissed. You're inviting chaos. What if one of them poisons your medicine next? That's enough, Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow louder than a shout. You don't see it, Eleanor whispered, stepping closer. They're watching you, waiting. You're a dying man with too much to give. They know that. Alexander turned. And what are you waiting for, Eleanor? For me to die so you can take my place? She flinched, just a little. I want what I've earned. He nodded slowly. Then maybe it's time you earned your severance. The next morning, Ethan found Alexander in the solarium shivering despite the heat. I know you're sick, Ethan said. Alexander didn't react. We all do. Dylan told you? Ethan shook his head. You don't hide it well. Alexander closed his eyes. Why did you really stay, Ethan? The boy hesitated. Then he said, simply, because you didn't ask anything from us. For a long moment, Alexander said nothing. Then, quietly, what if I ask now? That night, the lights flickered, power surged, security systems froze. Tyler and Thomas ran diagnostics on the server. Something or someone had breached the internal network. From the outside, it's not normal, Thomas muttered. Too clean, too specific. They were looking for something, Tyler said, but not anything on the main systems. In the corner, a forgotten tablet buzzed with a single notification. Live feed, camera 12 garden wall. Lucas opened it. There. She was the girl in red dot standing at the garden wall, holding something in her hand, a key. She turned and looked directly into the camera, and this time, she smiled. In the penthouse study, Alexander clutched a letter delivered by courier with no return address. He opened it with shaking fingers. Inside, a single phrase, "You've let them in." A second line, handwritten. The door was never locked. Would you like to continue with part 4? Where the boys begin to take control, Eleanor's true agenda is revealed, and Alexander's past finally comes crashing into the present. The snow had stopped, but the cold had deepened. Not the kind that made fingers numb or breath visible, but the kind that crept beneath walls, into marrow. The kind of cold that wasn't made by weather, the kind that came from secrets. 3 days had passed since the breach. The mansion now ran on a different rhythm, more guarded, more alert. The boys took shifts monitoring the security grid. The twins had rebuilt the firewall from the ground up, cutting the system off from the internet entirely. No cloud backups, no remote access. Nothing got in unless they said it could. We're a bunker now, Thomas muttered, soldering the last node on a localized data server. No, Tyler corrected. We're a war room. Ethan hadn't slept more than 4 hours since the breach. He was in Alexander's office, rifling through decades of financial reports, legal filings, and private letters. He was looking for patterns, for footprints. Because if someone was watching them, someone who knew about the girl, about the treatment, about them, then this wasn't just surveillance. It was infiltration. And Ethan had grown up with too many betrayals to ignore his instincts now. Meanwhile, Lucas had stopped drawing. The sketchbook lay untouched on the piano bench. Instead, he sat for hours in the winter garden, watching the perimeter, waiting, not for someone to come in but for her to return. He hadn't told the others, but she'd appeared again, in the hallway mirror, in the reflection of the wine glass, in the frost on the sunroom windows. Each time, she came closer. Each time, her smile grew wider. He didn't know what she wanted, but he was starting to suspect it wasn't just to be seen. Alexander Morgan was unraveling. The treatment, the experimental protocol Dylan had designed was working in strange ways. His cancer markers had dropped, yes, but so had his grip on linear time. He kept slipping into memories. Sometimes they came, without warning, Elizabeth brushing snow off his coat, laughing, young, alive. Sometimes they came with pain, her hand, cold in his, her breath shallow, whispering the name they never gave their daughter, Avery. He whispered it now, alone in the library, and when he looked up she was there. Red coat, bare feet, dark eyes filled with galaxies. Avery. He blinked. She was gone, and the air smelled faintly of roses and burning paper. Calvin returned on the 4th day. No one had seen him since the night of the breach, not even the household staff, who assumed. He quit quietly, like a shadow stepping backward into the dark. But now he stood in the doorway of the mansion's private chapel, a room no one used. He looked older, colder, but his eyes were alive. I need to speak to the boys, he told Alexander. About what? About the girl. Alexander didn't question how Calvin knew. He just nodded and sent for them. They gathered in the chapel, the 6 of them, Alexander and his 5 strange sons, each with their own jagged edges. Calvin stood before the altar like a man preparing to confess. I knew her, he said simply. Not the girl exactly, but what she is. What is she? Dylan asked, not blinking. A boundary, Calvin replied. A fault line between what was and what could have been. The silence was deafening. Lucas's voice cracked. Is she a ghost? Calvin shook his head. She's a reckoning. He turned to Alexander. You remember the building on 92nd and Lexington? The fire in 98. Alexander stiffened. I paid the settlement. Quietly, there was a girl. Calvin said, 9 years old. Died in that fire. Her name was Avery. Alexander whispered. Ethan flinched. But Avery was never born. Alexander said. Elizabeth miscarried. There was no. She was, Calvin said. Somewhere. Somewhen, and now she's come back. For what? Tyler asked. Calvin's eyes were glassy now. To finish what never started. Before anyone could speak, the lights snapped off. Emergency backups flickered on a beat later. Power failure, Thomas muttered, already pulling his tablet out. No, Tyler said, staring at the diagnostics. It's internal. Someone tripped the breaker from inside. At that moment, all the security cameras went offline. Every monitor went black except one. Camera 6. The stairwell outside the east wing. The girl in red stood in the middle of the hall, barefoot on the cold stone, holding something small and shining. A key, Lucas whispered, but not just any key dot. It was shaped like a tree branch, ancient, almost silver, and etched with symbols none of them recognized except Dylan. It's from my dream, Dylan said. Breathless, she showed me that key, said it unlocks what you buried. He looked at Alexander. What did you lock away? Alexander's throat went dry. In the wine cellar, he said. Behind the second false wall, there's a vault. I had it sealed years ago. What's in it? Ethan demanded. Alexander hesitated. The original Morgan files, the first shell companies, black accounts, old partnerships, things no one was supposed to see. Why? Lucas asked. Because some of what built this empire. Alexander looked down. Should have never been built at all. They turned back to the monitor. The girl was gone. Only the key remained resting. At the top of the stairs, waiting later that night, when the key was retrieved, they took it to the vault. The wall opened with a hiss, ancient air hissing from behind layers of metal and lies. Inside, boxes. Dozens of them, files, ledgers, names. One caught Ethan's eye. Orion Initiative, A. Hayes. He opened it. Inside, documents bearing Eleanor's name, not as an assistant, but as a director of a covert program aimed at identifying genetic investment opportunities among orphans and street children. Jesus, Tyler whispered. It was a human experiment. Dylan stared, his voice hollow. They weren't supposed to find us. We were supposed to be found. Alexander's heart stopped. They targeted you. Ethan lifted a page. No, they made us. The power snapped again. The vault door slammed shut, and from behind the metal, they heard it. A child's giggle, high, distant, and coming closer. Would you like to continue with part 5, where the truth behind the boy's origins, Eleanor's dark alliance, and Avery's final purpose are revealed, and the mansion becomes a battlefield between past sins and a future barely holding together? The vault door screamed as it slammed shut behind them. The sound didn't echo, it lingered. Like it was alive, feeding on fear. The lights inside flickered once, then stabilized. The air was cold, almost impossibly so, though no vents blew. It wasn't just temperature, it was history, compressed. Watching no one spoke for a long time. They stared at the files, thousands of them, neatly categorized in rows of matte black boxes with embossed red numbers. Nothing digital, all analog, as if the secrets inside couldn't risk touching the outside world. Tyler reached for another file. The page inside had no names, just designations. S1, subject, Thomas S2, subject, Tyler S4, subject, Lucas S5, subject, Dylan S3, status. Deceased subject. Tyler's voice was a whisper, his hand trembling. They numbered us? Ethan stepped forward and opened a thin red folder marked Orion Baseline Ethan, 01. Inside were photos, surveillance photos, not recent childhood. Him in an alley, sharing a half-eaten sandwich with Lucas, him jumping a subway turnstile, him sleeping curled around Dylan under a bridge, his entire life, documented, like an experiment under glass. I don't remember this, he said. I don't remember anyone watching us. They didn't want you to, Alexander said, his voice hollow. The Orion Initiative was founded in 2000 under a shell NGO, funded in part by Morgan Investments. Ethan looked up. You funded this. I didn't know what it really was, Alexander answered. I thought it was philanthropic. data mapping for child development, risk intervention, all sanitized terms. I didn't ask questions because the returns were clean, impressive. Lucas picked up a medical chart. The words behavioral acceleration, prefrontal enhancement, and cortical augmentation danced across the pages like a nightmare. This isn't philanthropy, Lucas said. This is manufacturing. Genetic manipulation, Dylan added quietly. Brain development under engineered trauma. They didn't just find us on the street. They put you there, Ethan finished, to see what we become. Back, upstairs, the mansion's hallways had changed. Lights flickered even when the power was on. Reflections didn't quite match movements. The painting seemed to shift when no one was watching. Calvin stood outside the chapel again, waiting. He looked older again. Did you know? Alexander asked, voice a blade wrapped in velvet. I suspected, Calvin said, that something bigger was happening, that the boys weren't just survivors. But I never knew the name, never saw the files. Why didn't you tell me? Because the person you were wouldn't have believed. Me. Behind them, the girl in red appeared at the far end of the hallway, silent, still. This time, all 6 of them saw her. She raised a single hand and pointed to Alexander. She's blaming me. He said later, in the East Library, she's always blamed me. She's not blaming you, Dylan said, walking slowly around the perimeter of the room, tracing symbols on the walls with his fingers. She's waking you up. Alexander didn't understand, and Dylan didn't elaborate. Instead, he turned and whispered something no one expected. She's not Avery. Everyone froze. What do you mean? Lucas asked. I think Avery was never born because she wasn't supposed to be, but something else came through instead. Dylan looked down. She's not a ghost. She's a wound. That night, Eleanor Hayes returned, not through the front door, through the security system. Tyler's alert went off at 3:17 a.m. He and Thomas sprinted from the east wing to the main foyer, arriving just in time to see her walking down the grand staircase, as if she'd never left, as if it was still her house. Her heels clicked once, twice, then stopped. Hello, boys, she said, smiling coldly. Ethan appeared behind her with the tranquil force of a predator. What do you want? Eleanor turned, casual, to finish what I started. Alexander stepped from the shadows behind a column. You started this. Eleanor didn't flinch. I was chosen to oversee it. Do you know what it's like to spend your life cleaning up your boss's sins? To make their empire invincible only to be replaced by children? She walked slowly toward the fireplace, fingers tracing the mantle. You gave them your name, your money, your legacy. And for what? They don't understand power. They think it's emotional, moral. They'll throw it away. They already changed it, Lucas said. They made it better. They corrupted it, Eleanor snarled. Just like they corrupted you. She pulled a device from her coat, slim, black, with a blinking red light. Alexander's cancer is public record now. So are your financials, your adoption papers, your experimental treatments. You're a scandal, waiting to burn. She pressed the button. The security systems began to shut down, one by one. By morning, she said, Morgan Investments will fall. The board has already initiated emergency succession. Lawson is back, and I'll be his second. Alexander stared at her, then at the boys, then at the blinking light. And finally, he did something no one expected. He laughed. Eleanor, he said softly, you always thought you were playing chess. But these boys, he gestured, they're playing dimensions. The floor beneath Eleanor flickered an augmented grid projection. The twins grinned. Gotcha, Thomas said. They had created a honeypot of fake system just for her. Every keystroke, every connection she made since her return had been logged, traced, and broadcast to a secure server where federal cybercrimes agents were already watching. You're not just getting fired this time, Ethan said. You're going to disappear. I'll drag you all down with me, she shrieked. But her voice was already echoing off the inside of a reinforced police van. Agents moved in, and as she was escorted out, she locked eyes with Dylan. You're not human, she hissed. None of you are. No, Dylan replied, voice like winter. We're more. That night, the boys sat in Alexander's study. No one slept. Are we? Lucas started. Were we made? Yes, Alexander said. But what you do with that is yours now. You still believe we can change the world? Ethan asked. Alexander didn't hesitate. I believe you already have. Outside, the city began to stir again. Lights came back on. But inside the mansion, shadows still move without source. And in the deepest corners of the vault beneath the wine cellar, something stirred in the dark, not finished, not yet. The city woke uneasy. It wasn't the snow, or the scandal, or the headline screaming Morgan Empire in free fall. It was something older than fear, a pressure in the air, a silence beneath the noise, a sense, deep in the bones, that something irreversible had already happened and no one had noticed except 6 people in the Morgan mansion. The boys stood around the study's war table, where architectural blueprints had been replaced by surveillance maps, financial printouts, decrypted Orion, files, and one object none of them dared touch. The key. It had reappeared on Dylan's bed at dawn. Cold, heavy, wrapped in a red silk ribbon that didn't exist the night before. Same symbols. Lucas whispered, "But there's something new at the base of the key. Etched so finely it looked like a scar. Genesis null. A1. Avery," Dylan said. And suddenly the silence broke. Not with noise, with memory. A soundless wave crashed through the room, and in its wake, each of them saw something different. Ethan saw himself as a baby alone in a sterile pod. Machines humming like lullabies. A clipboard hung above his crib that read baseline candidate. Cognitive complexity high. The twins saw diagrams of their brains, split screens comparing their thought maps to supercomputers. Lucas saw his own eyes, scanned over and over again under different names, tracking empathy markers that rose above even known outliers. Dylan saw the girl in red, but this time, she spoke. "You were born for the collapse," she said. "Now, choose what rises in its place." Then the visions were gone. The silence returned. But something had shifted. They weren't just boys anymore. Not orphans. Not experiments. Not survivors. They were catalysts. Alexander Morgan stood in the wine cellar, alone, staring at the now open vault. He'd been coming here every night. Reading every line of every file for most of his life. He built an empire on the illusion of legitimacy. But what he'd really built, what he now understood, was an altar. And the sacrifice had always been children. Children like these 5. Children who had inherited what his generation could never control. A voice spoke behind him, calm, familiar. "You've finally seen it." Calvin stepped into the vault light. "How much did you know?" Alexander asked. Calvin didn't lie. "Enough to be haunted, not enough to stop it." Alexander nodded. "Then we stop it now." That night, they gathered in the East Library, the safest room left. Lead line. Signal dampened. Sealed. Tyler activated the projection screen. "What you're looking at," he said, "is the neural infrastructure of Orion's global node. This is where the others are stored." "Others?" Alexander echoed. "The ones who didn't survive the streets," Dylan answered. "They were put into cryogenic stasis, too unstable, too advanced." He turned the display. Dozens, maybe hundreds of child-sized chambers, labeled only by numbers, frozen faces. Orion was building gods, Ethan said, and when they couldn't control them, they buried them. Lucas stood, but someone's waking them up. A red dot blinked on the map. Lab 3, Manhattan. Activation sequence triggered. 72 hours. "That's why Avery's back," Dylan said. "She's not here to haunt us. She's here to warn us." Alexander looked at them. "Then we go in." They moved like shadows through the abandoned facility, once hidden beneath the old Bryant Military Hospital. They passed empty corridors and flickering lights. Dylan stopped first. "This is it. Room A1. Inside, a chamber, empty. Wires dangling. Frost along the walls." The pod had been opened from the inside. "She was here," Lucas said, "but she's not anymore." From behind them, a sound. Soft. A footstep. They turned, and there she was. Avery. But not 9.17. Her red coat was gone. She wore a simple black dress. Her eyes were the same, but now ancient, ageless, furious and sorrowful all at once. "I didn't want this," she said, her voice layered like it was many voices at once. "I wasn't meant to be born, but I was made anyway." Alexander stepped forward. "Avery," she looked at him and he felt it, the truth, the gravity. "I was the prototype," she said, "the seed, the first failed success, the warning they ignored." Behind her, screens flickered on. Footage played. The others, Orion children waking in labs across the world. Abandoned facilities reigniting. Systems long dormant rebooting. "It's begun," she said. "The cycle. You tried to play gods. But gods don't build cages. They build kingdoms." Dylan stepped forward. You're not our enemy. No, she said, but I'm your mirror. Ethan stared at her. So what now? Avery looked at each of them. You choose, she raised. A hand dot and in it, a second key dot silver, marked override, Ascension Protocol. This opens the Genesis core, she said, the one place where all Orion data children, research, projections is stored. If you open it, she continued, you can shut it all down, permanently. But if you do, every child still in cryo dies with it. Silence. Lucas's voice cracked. We'd be killing them. You'd be sparing them from what I became. Ethan turned to Alexander. You made this world. Alexander looked at Avery. And now you'll end it. No, Avery whispered. You will. They stood before the Genesis core. 5 lights. Glow. 5 touchpads. Each key to a boy, each required a choice. Ethan placed his hand on the pad. Then Tyler. Then Thomas. Then Lucas. Then Dylan. The system blinked. Override ready. Final confirmation required, said the voice of the system. Alexander stepped forward. His palm hovered. They'll never forgive us. He said. No, Ethan said, but maybe they'll survive because of us. Alexander pressed his hand down. The system powered down. All across the world, labs went dark. Screens blacked out. Cryopods failed. Silence returned. And Avery? She smiled once and vanished like smoke. Weeks passed. The scandal faded. The empire stabilized. Morgan Investments became Morgan Initiatives. The foundation expanded. New youth labs opened. New programs launched. And behind it all, 5 young men who understood power because they had survived its worst expression, and one man, now healed, who stood beside them. One night, Dylan sat alone in the library again. He looked out at the winter sky. And whispered, did we do the right thing? A breeze moved through the open window. Pages fluttered. A candle went out. And in the distance, the faintest echo of a girl's voice. You didn't choose right or wrong. You chose mercy. Dylan smiled and finally closed the book.